In fact, there was visits to Germany by British educators during the 1950s, and they came back saying, who exactly won the war?
Hello, welcome to the Ideas Sleep Furiously podcast. I'm Matt Archer. Today I'm speaking with Peter Hitchens. Peter has been one of the UK's most important journalists for many decades now. He worked as a foreign correspondent in Moscow and Washington. He won the prestigious Orwell Prize in 2010 and is the author of many books, including The Abolition of Britain, which I have here, The Rage Against God, The War We Never Fought, and The Phoney Victory. I wanted to speak to Peter, however, about a subject that he is passionate about, education, specifically academic selection and grammar schools. For non-UK listeners, grammar schools are free selective schools in the UK. At their height in the 60s, there were over 1,200 of these schools, but they were eventually closed down, they were abolished. In fact, it was Margaret Thatcher who closed the most grammar schools when she was Education Secretary. Now, Peter believes that these schools were an imperfect gold standard, but a gold standard nonetheless. And their closure resulted in the lowering of educational standards across the board, grade inflation, and fewer bright working class kids going to places like Oxford and Cambridge. Now, remember, you can listen to this podcast on all the major podcasting platforms, and if you are new to this channel, then make sure to subscribe to the main channel, which is where I post a whole variety of educational content in philosophy and psychology and other subjects, as well as the most interesting clips from this podcast series, the full discussions of which are uploaded onto this channel. All those links are in the description down below, and with that, I give you Peter Hitchens. Okay, so the first question we have for you is what it means to be truly educated. You're obviously a fan of Matthew Arnold's view of culture, that culture is about the best that's been thought and said and passing that on to the next generation. Do you think that's what it means to be truly educated? Do you think that's part of it? Are you a fan of, for example, David Goodhart's view that every school should teach something to do with the heart, obviously metaphorically, the hand, craft skills, and also the cognitive skills that you would have in a grammar school or a more selective school?
I'm not a fan of anything David Goodhart says, but I don't think, I'm not myself an educator. I wouldn't try and set out a curriculum for people to follow or to define exactly what it means to be educated. The Matthew Arnold statement is really cliche, isn't it? It allows people to say that's broadly what they want. But I know myself that I am very poorly educated by my own standards. I'm constantly aware of it. I wish that I knew more, particularly of the classics. I wish I could speak and write in foreign languages. And there are many other things that I'm discontented about. I think the fundamental position of being educated is to be in a state of informed discontent, so that you have a pretty good idea, at least, of what you don't know and how much it matters. But I certainly wouldn't prescribe to anybody what they should learn, which would make them an educated person.
See, this is quite concerning, because you are someone who's you obviously have a national newspaper column. You've written what I think of as incredibly important books. In Roger Scruton's book, England, an Elegy, he cites your book as incredibly important. So if you're saying you're not educated, do you think that...
I know I'm not educated. I sabotaged my own education in detail around about the age of 15, and it's never recovered from it. And that's by the standards of when I was going to school. It's the very middle of the 1960s, just before the dissolution of the grammar schools revolutionised secondary education in this country. So I was getting something approaching a proper education, but I never actually got it.
So are those the standards that you look to, the 1960s, as these Oxbridge dons who kind of knew all of history? That's what it meant to be.
They're the only ones that I know. I know what we were expected to know reasonably as educated citizens of an advanced country. I could see perfectly well what it was I was going to be learning and what I was going to be tested in, but I didn't get there, so I know that I missed it. The fascinating thing about living in modern Britain is that people actually accuse me of being an intellectual. When I know for certain that my knowledge is full of gigantic gaps. I just don't know huge numbers of things. I'm not familiar with important authors. I'm not familiar with important aspects of philosophy. I'm almost totally ignorant of the natural sciences. So no, I don't. It amazes me that it's a measure for me of the decline of the country that I can pass as an educated person.
See, the thing is, I struggle with this because do you think it's then possible to be truly educated if Roger Scruton is the only person who's truly educated?
Well, I could never understand most of what Roger Scruton was saying, so it obviously is possible to be truly educated, but it was plainly beyond me.
So do you think there are only ever going to be a few people who are?
Well, there's certainly only going to be a few people who are educated and knowledgeable to the standard that Roger Scruton reached. But I didn't much like what I did try of his. I have problems with a lot of people who are much idolised by others. I can't stand most of G.K. Chesterton, for instance. And I've never really got on with Roger Scruton's writing. And when I listened to him speak, I found myself drifting off into the realms of what you might politely call speculation. He's not for me. I'm not. I keep saying I am just a jobbing scribbler.
But should it be people like?
Yes.
Sorry. Oh, sure. Sorry. Should it be people like Roger Scruton then, or as educated as him as you deem him to be, who decide what the best is to impart?
I don't know. That's been decided by the history of the world, and people have come to these conclusions that all the great schools and universities which have existed down the centuries have refined what they have believed until the recent revolution, what they have believed was necessary to know. Now, I'd say there may be another kind of society in which a different set of things might need to be known. But what the revolution has done is it's fundamentally said that we don't need to know these things anymore. It's been a revolution against knowledge, against the canon of knowledge, against a set idea of what's to be known. It's liberated people from necessarily needing to know anything, and in many cases, it's elevated the ignorant and the poorly read to positions of great eminence. So it's not whatever the new revolution is. It's not proposing a replacement of the old. Somebody might, in which case we could argue about whether it was better or worse. But it's plainly, to me, worse to have a revolution which elevates ignorance and diminishes the importance of it, and indeed pushes to one side knowledge and understanding.
Is there anybody you could identify now who you think would be in a place to push a counter-reformation in terms of identifying what should be in a modern canon, for example, in humanities degrees? Do you think these people, there are people, for example, I know Neil Ferguson is a relatively well-regarded historian. Do you think you could identify a few people who...
No, but I have no interest in that. Anyway, my view is civilization is irrevocably collapsing around us, and I don't expect there to be any rescue. I'm not sitting on a desert island waiting for the puff of smoke from the rescuing steamship. It's over. So I don't look for that kind of thing. And there will be people who resist it, people who continue to observe old standards for a while, but in the end they'll be driven out.
And for those people, perhaps unrealistically, slightly optimistic, trying to survive, who would you point to? What kind of figures would you point to? And what locations might there be?
Well, I wouldn't. They can look for them if they're crazy enough to be optimistic under these circumstances. They can look for them themselves. But if you're clinging to the wreckage, it seems to me to be idle to start trying to design a country house.
Yeah. Do you see any hope in figures like Jordan Peterson or the kind of accolade?
Absolutely not. No. I mean, I think Jordan Peterson's cult is an absurdity. Have you read his book?
The first one. Well, the second one.
Oh, no, I haven't. The first was enough for me.
So I think there's a nuance here, right? Because I read your review, I think, in the Spectator of Peterson's book. However, what he's doing with his podcast, I think, truly is an emancipatory... I mean, the technology itself is emancipatory, but...
Well, I say you're very welcome to it.
Well, it's both a symptom of the demise of the universities and...
Well, maybe culture. It is, but it's nothing to do with... It's nothing to do with thought. It's a cult. It's somebody offering some sort of apparent hope in a world where there isn't very much.
Right.
Do you not believe in any type of figurehead? Do you think people should actually...
No, I'm against temporal hope. It's what one of the 19th century popes called satanic optimism. It's foolish. You just delude yourself.
As embodied in a specific individual, you're
Well, particularly, yes. I mean, there is no temporal hope.
Because it's an enterprise, not a culture.
Yeah.
We want to ask you about the best arguments in favour of, against actually to begin, academic selection and reviving grammar schools that you've encountered.
Well, there isn't one. The fascinating thing is that the opponents of academic selection in British schools never actually said these schools are bad. They never said they provided a bad education. They said that the price of this, in terms of mainly of political egalitarianism, was too high for them, and they preferred a more politically equal society in which the privilege of education was destroyed rather than distributed more widely, than that it should continue. They only ever attacked it obliquely. They would attack, for instance, the 11 plus examination. With reason, it wasn't necessarily the best way of achieving selection. But you will find even in some of the fiercest attacks on grammar schools, they will say, well, yes, these are good schools. Mm. So there isn't one. They never had one. And there was no, it's noticeable, there is no book to which you can turn anywhere, and no research program anywhere which says that if you have comprehensive education, education will be better. Nobody has ever really made that statement. In fact, the founder of the inventor of the term comprehensive school, Graham Savage, admitted in his initial writings about it that there would be a loss. But they wanted, as he put it, he wanted a more democratic society. He was very much afraid that there was that if the society was not more equalised, there would be a revolution. That was his driving fear.
And as you say, it was a system very much borrowed from the American ideal, right?
Savage's initial paper was written after a visit to the United States and Canada.
So if you took all of the arguments that, let's face it, our enemies make against grammar schools and selection more generally, I disagree, because I don't think they're all equal. I think some are better than others. So, for example, we've got the stigma, what you've spoken about, and you alluded to the fact that 11 may be too young, maybe 13, so maybe we could...
But I accept these arguments. I think 11 may be too young in some cases. It would be foolish to be rigid about age. I think that the 11 plus, which was a noble attempt to overcome class prejudice in origin, in fact, and it was never the only basis on which children were selected for grammar schools. But I think there are things to be said against it. The Germans managed to select without it. So it's not the point. But an actual frontal attack on the idea of having schools with academic selection was never made.
What do you deem the best method for selection to be?
Well, I'm prepared to listen to argument. If anybody gives me the opportunity to re-establish a selective system, I'll listen to anything anybody says. I mean, certainly, I think 11 may be too early, but you have to be careful not to leave it too late. If you leave it too late, then the bright child from the poor home will already have sunk. So if you wait, for instance, for sixth form colleges, which in many cases are very good schools, it's very rare for anybody to reach the age of 16 from a poor home in a dud comprehensive school who's going to get into a sixth form college. Whereas at 11, the chances of spotting somebody before they sink are much higher. So you can't go too high. Yeah. So you have to find a compromise in there, and you also have to have rescues of people who've been failed, and back routes later on. In fact, a lot of these things did exist, and the portrayal of the system as it existed before is often unfair. A lot of effort was made by teachers to try and make sure people didn't miss out on what they ought to get.
So was there actually a route in the 60s and the 70s beyond the 11 plus?
Oh yes, there were 13 plus tests, and if people were found in secondary modern schools to be of a high standard, then they would be transferred. Not many. Right. There was also later on, that was one of the main things which destroyed the system, was the huge baby bulge which ran through the schools after 1945 and hit the grammar schools in 1956, when of course there were many more pupils who were qualified to go, but the schools had not been expanded. There was no room for them, so an awful lot of people qualified for grammar schools were sent to secondary moderns, and many of them ended up taking GCE O-levels and then switching to grammar schools to do A-levels. It's very hard to find figures for this, but it was not as rigid as people believed that it was. and nor were the secondary moderns as disastrous as universally disastrous as people say. They varied, as comprehensives vary very considerably. Some of them were of a pretty high standard by the end, but it was never that simple.
I want to dwell for a second before we get on to the main arguments for selection and grammar schools on one of the critiques which I find, and again you acknowledge, is it's hard to answer in any precise detail, but at the same time it's probably not something that we need to worry about at the expense of saying, no, grammar schools are a bad thing, and that's stigma. So I remember being, I don't know if I was 7 or 8 years old, and for whatever reason I wasn't paying attention to how to learn the time, and I was put into a side group in the class, given these sheets with analog clocks on, and I remember within 20 minutes I thought, oh well, this is easy, I shouldn't be here. But everybody else in that small group was clearly, they had some type of intellectual disability or behavioural issue. So I felt that stigma, oh well, I shouldn't be here. So the last, I'm in favour of selection. I'm in favour of actually much more rigid selection than we had in the mid-60s and even gifted schools. But I don't want anybody to feel so stigmatised that they're still thinking about it when they're 55. Their brothers got into grammar school and they didn't. So do you think there's any way to ameliorate that? I mean, you've spoken about a few of those ways, but for example, could we have pragmatically a point of entry every single year? Is there any way, in addition to that, to, if you're going to have selection,
why would you have it? Why would you be rigid? Why would, if somebody had failed to get into a grammar school at 11 or 13, why, if at 15 or 16 they turned out to be qualified for it, would anybody bother to resist letting them switch? What would be the point?
So I agree with that, but do you think there's any way, if we're going to have selection, say the 1,300 grammar schools of the mid-60s, is there any way to not have people feel so stigmatised that they still think about it at 55?
I don't know. I don't know how many people did feel stigmatised.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's very little working on it. And the most prominent example I can think of is John Prescott, who was so stigmatised that he became Deputy Prime Minister. So I don't know. What is one supposed to do? Yeah. What seems to me to be much, much worse is to find somebody who's clever and sharp and has all the talents, and to tell that person throughout a terrible education that he or she is passing exams with high grades, and then at the end of it for them to find out that they're not well educated in an immensely competitive world, and that they can't cope because they were never given the chance to learn. That seems to me to be a much more terrible stigma to place on somebody, to make them into a failure while kidding them that they're a success, and to waste their talent. You have to choose.
Yeah.
And it's not, the life of the world is not some great big Montessori school. We can't make everybody happy.
Yeah. And also,
I don't think even Montessori schools manage to do that.
Absolutely. And let's also make sure that we note that the kid who is, got an IQ of 85 and struggles to write a letter, putting them in a class, any class of mixed ability, where they feel like a moron, is not nice. Right? They need to go at their own pace.
It's a fascinating thing, but when Anthony Crosland was proposing that we went to a comprehensive education system, he flatly denied that it would mean mixed ability teaching. He said it wouldn't happen. It's in the future of socialism. He says it's not going to happen. There wouldn't be any such thing. And he denied that it would cause all the problems that the American education system had undergone. He said he didn't understand what he was doing.
And what did he think would happen instead of mixed ability classes?
I think he thought that some sort of streaming would become universal. But there was a very strong campaign in the late 60s among left-wing teachers against streaming, and in a lot of places it was more or less abolished.
In the 60s?
It survives, yeah, it began then. It was very militant. It was very successful, as streaming has sort of returned to setting in some subjects now. But the other thing about grammar schools and comprehensives was that a lot of the comprehensives inherited quite a lot of grammar school teachers and traditions, continued in some cases to have teachers wearing mortarboards and gowns and honours boards on the walls and religious services at the beginning. But at the same time as the change took place, the Cultural Revolution was going on, and the comprehensive schools weren't able to maintain these things in the way that grammars could have done, and they gradually abandoned them. And of course there was, among, again, the radical teachers who were very much in favour of the change, there was great hostility to such things anyway. So it wasn't just a simple matter of going from grammar school to comprehensive. Some of the early comprehensives would seem to a school child of today to be fantastically disciplined, rigid, silent, streamed, and all the rest of it. It didn't last.
This was a point that we were discussing earlier about the not being, well, the onus not being entirely on academic selection, but also on a culture. We were talking about...
There was a huge expansion of the teaching profession because the school leaving age there was a preparation underway to raise the school leaving age, and the baby buzz caused an unending demand for new teachers, and the expansion of teacher training also meant changes in teacher training. So the kinds of people who actually became teachers were different sorts of people from before, and perhaps less well educated in some cases too. So that changed at the same time.
So let's get on to it then. If you had to boil down the top 3 arguments for grammar schools and academic selection, what do you think they would be? I mean, you famously said that this is something that we should do, even if only 10 to 15% of the people attending these schools were on free school meals, because social mobility isn't the key reason to do this. It's a good in and of itself.
Isn't it? The middle class is not a hereditary class. It's a class which both recruits and discards. So it would be amazing if a class which depends so much, particularly on the educated professions, didn't place a high value on education and didn't have, in many cases, children who did well in school. It's ridiculous to be against grammar schools because some of the people who go to them are middle class. But the fundamental reason, the most powerful reason for academic selection is to avoid the otherwise tragic waste of talent. That's the first. And the other reason is that for the sake of the national good, you need to have a class of people who know how to think. And if you don't have proper, rigorous secondary education, you won't have such a class of people, which seems to me to be demonstrated daily in this country at the moment. Our supposedly elite classes are almost unbelievably ignorant and incompetent and are unable to take intelligent decisions about practically anything. Listen to them. Listen to discourse in the House of Commons now. It used to be the case, it isn't anymore because the House of Lords has been diluted beyond belief. But 30 years ago, you could walk along the corridor from the House of Commons, which was largely post-revolutionary, and go to the House of Lords, and the difference between the standard of debate was immense. The Lords would speak in formed sentences, would argue logically and reasonably, and from knowledge. And in the Commons, people would tend to shout slogans. Now it's all shouted slogans. And this is from front benches we're talking about as well, not just the foot soldiers.
So what kind of individual, not group, not society, what kind of individual should benefit most ideally by grammar schools and academic selection?
Well, I think you know when you see it. I think a teacher is going to see the enthusiasm, the readiness to learn. It's different if it's somebody who's immensely talented or is going to be immensely talented in mathematics and the sciences. They're going to be different from somebody who's going to be a possible philosopher, or somebody who's going to be a future teacher, or somebody who's going to be any of those things. Who needs to be rigid about it? But I would have thought that any teacher in primary school, particularly towards the later years, would be aware of the fact that there are going to be girls and boys in their class who are obviously better suited to an academic education than others. And at the moment, they're all flung pell-mell into the same sorts of schools as people who aren't interested in that. And it just makes sense for them to be in smaller schools, which can be small because they don't need to be huge to have decent-sized sixth forms. And they can be put into such schools among people like themselves, against whom they can compete reasonably, and who they won't hold back and who they won't be held back by.
I want to tell you an anecdote about a student that I taught. He is in Mensa. I think he has an IQ of about 142, so that would place him well inside the top 1%. He is a phenomenally gifted philosopher. I met him when he was 13, so in year 9, worked with him year 9, year 10, and recently getting him into his A-levels. He read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, all of Plato. This was a gifted person. I mean, if you look at the IQ bell curve distribution, he would probably be 1 in 100,000, possibly higher. But he was incredibly intellectually curious, right? And he was firmly driven by philosophy, some interest in mathematics. I was a kind of life draft in that school, where he would gravitate to philosophy, and obviously it's in a set curriculum, and I've got a mixability class, so it's already hard enough to give him, to differentiate and give him something to chew on. When I would speak to teachers, they would tell me that, I'll use another name. John is, he might be very good in philosophy, but he really needs to learn how to write a PEA paragraph, right? Point, evidence, analysis. He just isn't very good at English. Or his mathematics needs a bit of improvement. And I got this sense that they were annoyed that he was much smarter than they will ever be, much more well-read than any English teacher will ever be, and they wanted to put him down. And this was a kid he'd been to a school in the Netherlands. If you're familiar with the expression, cutting the poppies to size, this is what had happened to this
Well, you
kid.
may well be right. I have no experience of this. It wouldn't surprise me. It would be in the nature of an egalitarian system that it finds it hard to cope with people who don't rub along with it. But it's not for me to talk about because I haven't seen it happen.
But what I'm trying to say is that this is what a grammar school is for these people.
Well, maybe so. I think certainly it would. But there are plenty of people who aren't as outstanding as that who would benefit from it. I mean, there are exceptional. There are always people so exceptional that even the dimmest person can spot it. But I'm not really talking about the absolutely exceptional. I'm talking about possibly the top 25 to 30%.
Indeed, that's a sector of the student population that we worked out was attending grammar schools.
We think it varied because in some areas there were far too few of them, and in others there were enough. So, for instance, in Wales you had a very good chance of getting into a grammar school, whereas in Surrey virtually none, and in some poor areas as well. They were very thin on the ground. Some of them the provision was down to about 10 or 11%, I think.
So this is what we wanted to ask you about, because Ines has studied psychology. I'm very interested in educational psychology. 26%, if that is the number we're going to take in the mid-60s going to grammar school, that does seem to us to be quite high if you look at the IQ distribution, because that would mean that someone with an IQ of about 110 is getting into grammar school, and that's not...
Well, these aren't gifted and talented special academies. No. They're just schools for the normally educationally competent, the kind of people who are interested in academic education. Part of the problem with this country and many other countries is we've never been able to work out what to do with people who are not academically able, but who are otherwise able. Germany, for instance, has extremely good technical schools, which we've never had. In fact, there was visits to Germany by British educators during the 1950s, and they came back saying, who exactly won the war? Their schools seem to be doing much. We hardly ever had a proper sector of technical schools. They theoretically existed, and in some parts there were few in Manchester. There was one in Oxford, but they were very rare, and they never achieved much of a standing. So we never did that. So what we do is we provide third-rate academic education to everybody.
Well, that's the key to the argument that put forth by Ed Hart.
Hart, yeah.
Yeah, by David Goodhart, and he does to look at German education as a way to refurbish.
I'll bow to your superior knowledge of David Goodhart.
So on gifted education, I'm very interested in this, and the student I see as someone who's been left behind. I was very shocked to see, or not that surprised, that the UK government set up in 2002 a programme called Young, Gifted and Talented. That was scrapped in 2010.
I'm surprised they didn't scrap it in 2003.
In order to allocate funds, if the Wikipedia article is correct, to disadvantaged students. This is ridiculous.
That's all they always ever do. They will have these projects, but it's all finding individuals and trying to surround them with assistance or give them extra this or that or direct extra funds to somewhere. But there is an absolute prohibition in law on setting up schools which select on the basis of ability. You can't do it. The ones which exist are reprieved. You can do it at 16. And these famous academies in London, which do so well, they all select brutally at 16. And you can do it in sixth form colleges. So Hills Road Sixth Form College in Cambridge is one of the best schools in the country.
The academics send their kids.
Of course, but it's you can do it there. But if you want to set up a new school which selects at 11, then it's against the law. You cannot do it against the law. Amazing. And whenever I say it to myself, I think, what are they going to do? Call the police? It is that mad. They actually made it illegal.
It's mad and very sad for these.
Yeah, it's awful. But no, all kinds of efforts are made. I mean, there are gifted and talented programs in American schools, and there are a couple of American high schools. I think Stuyvesant in New York and Thomas Jefferson in Northern Virginia, which have attempted to introduce some sort of academic selection, though they have inevitably run into the sort of problems you might expect by doing so. But they do try from time to time. It's not illegal there, but it just doesn't fit with the general high school system, which is neighborhood. Therefore, when I lived in Bethesda in Maryland, real estate advertisements for houses would say Pyle and Whitman, meaning referring to the junior high and the high school in the area, which were the best schools for many, many miles around, which were almost entirely attended by the children of the extremely well off. And that's how they do it.
Yeah, this is also the case.
You have to be plutocratic to afford private education in the USA. There's a lot of that in Washington, D.C. as well.
There's a lot of people from the North who also travel to a county in Florida called Sarasota that has brilliant, relatively brilliant. Relatively brilliant. Still Florida, still the United States. Selective schools, or schools that are vast and have a streaming program or an IB International Baccalaureate program that selects students on academic merit, but not on IQ. Whereas there's another school in that county called Pineview, which does select on the basis of IQ tests, but the threshold is below the gifted, but above that of grammar schools, so around 120, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, there are other places do it. I mean, the main examples. I mean, the Netherlands has a fair amount of academic selection. It's quite complicated by our standards, and Germany has it. I think Austria has it as well, and Switzerland has some form of it. I've never been able to discover because it's canton based, but lots of people have it, and it's not it's not unknown. We hear it is technically illegal to start to revive it where it's been destroyed.
Yeah, and many countries that do not have it then only have grammar school level schools, and those who cannot make it have to repeat years.
Oh, the repeating of the year is something which you just don't hear of it here. But it's Russian schools. You just if you don't make it, you just don't move up, which is far more ruthless, it seems to me, in the selection.
Well, a lot of people don't think so. Better to survive in that system
and
not have differentiation, which is a strange argument, but might make some cultural sense, I suppose. We're still equal if we're part of the same pond, but some of us make it out of the pond and become frogs, and others just continue being little tadpoles. I don't know. That's a fit analogy, but that's my experience of it, having studied in Spain, where the schools are generally more difficult than they are on average in this country.
But they hold you back a year if you don't make it.
Yeah, and it's so common to repeat a year because it's difficult enough that there's very little stigma attached to having repeated a year. If you have repeated 2, then maybe there's something wrong with you.
How many times can you do it?
I don't know. I guess it depends on the school and the other demographic factors, cultural.
Well, I expect they have nicer neighbourhoods in Spain as well.
I don't know whether. No, not a lot of greenery.
So back to gifted and talented then. Do you think that there should be some type of gifted and talented school system where the grammar schools would actually identify
I have
these
no
gifts?
opinions on that at all. I try to stick to what I have actually studied. I really don't know. As I say, I'm not an educationist. I try to keep it narrow. My concern is fundamentally a political one.
See,
I'm as political as the people who destroyed the grammar schools. I think that I have strong political reasons for wanting them back, but as I'm not, there are good educational reasons for having them too. Whereas the comprehensive fanatics Their only arguments were political. They had no educational arguments.
So I just see the gifted and talented school system, were there to be one, as a natural extension of grammar school.
Well, as you may be right, I simply don't know, and I know nothing about it. And I've learnt over an extremely long life to try quite hard not to talk about things I know absolutely nothing.
I appreciate
that. If I know a little about it, I can talk about it. Nothing is generally a bad.
One thing we didn't mention was your incredibly important argument about selection by house price. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, it's just obvious.
Yeah. Well, it's obvious to
they
us.
They knew it was raised at the time that the plan for going comprehensive was being, the opponents of it said, you will get neighbourhood schools, and in Britain neighbourhoods will mean some schools will be largely surrounded by poor housing and others by well-off. It's just it barely needs saying. It's sometimes it will rain. It's a banality.
Yeah,
people. It's how New Labour people get round the state school system. You look at the catchment area of Camden School for Girls, which, by the way, takes boys in the sixth form, and it's tiny. And there are very well-off left-wing people who have bought extremely expensive houses in its catchment area simply to get their children into it.
Or, as you say, they pretend to be a certain faith for a while.
That's another thing you can do, yes. But a lot of left-wing people can't really do that.
Not convincingly.
Not even at all.
They do need
they wouldn't want.
approval.
They wouldn't want.
Yeah, this one's
they
for real.
absolutely wouldn't want to. But there are two methods, and that is the other one.
Could you tell people? We've got a lot of American and North American listeners. Could you tell people about your famous quote about the London Oratory School?
Well, I had an argument with the Blair family about the London Oratory School, which is an extremely, by the standards of the British state education system, an extremely rigorous secondary school in West London, many miles from where Mr. Blair and his wife and the large family lived, not large, medium-sized family, lived in Islington in North London when he was leader of the opposition. And yet it turned out that he was sending one of his children to this school, London Oratory. And because, allegedly of religious reasons, that I believe there was a Roman Catholic school a lot nearer his home than the London Oratory. And I wrote an article in which I said that Mr. Blair and his wife were avoiding the comprehensive system which they wanted to impose on everybody else. And Mrs. Blair responded angrily and said that it was absolutely not true, that the London Oratory was a comprehensive school, which technically it was. Let's not go into the hours and hours and hours of reasons why it wasn't that comprehensive. But in the end, I agreed a statement in which I said that, yes, indeed, the London Oratory is a comprehensive school in the same way that number 10 Downing Street is an inner-city terraced house.
Factually true.
Absolutely factually true. All the facts are true, but the impression is entirely misleading.
Maybe they had a really musical child.
Well, anyway, that's no. It's this thing. The religious thing is actually quite embarrassing for persons who are genuinely religious to look at the way that it's used by people. On the other hand, I suspect that quite a large number of English middle class people are introduced to the Christian religion, and their children are as well, as a result of the constant strolls that get their children into the better state schools. So it probably has quite a good effect. Some of them may even believe it by the end of it.
I have wondered whether there would be as many Catholics as there are in West London, were it not for the London Oratory.
There is. It's a reasonable suspicion. But there you are. We must give thanks for those things for which we must give thanks.
We had a question about alternatives to the grammar school system, which nonetheless may be selective. So is there any system that you can convey or concoct that would be better than the past grammar school system that you would like to see?
No, I can't. No, I'd be willing to listen to arguments, but again, I write on the basis of history and experience, and also existing practice in those countries which do select. Right. It seems to me to be about as good as you can get for that sort of thing.
But you would rather favour the German system, which includes grammar school?
Well, it seems to me to work, and also it's popular. And this is the most fascinating story of all, is when the German Democratic Republic collapsed, and they had a modified comprehensive system, which is, I think, all through schools from, I think, about 7 to 18, ordinary Oberschüler. But about 14 or 15% went to extended upper schools, erweiterte Oberschule, which you entered later. These tended to be, obviously they weren't necessarily untalented people, but it tended to help a lot if you'd already signed up and said you were going to join the army and do officer training, or your parents were members of the Communist Party, or you had a good record in the Freie Deutsche Jugend or some other communist front organization. If you had a bad political record, the chances of your getting into them were very small. But they only took 14%, and if you couldn't get into one of these, you pretty certainly wouldn't get into university either. So there was a lot of resentment of them. So when the East German regime fell, all the new Länder in Germany received petitions from large numbers of parents saying, "Please, can we have our gymnasium back, which we had before?" And they were reintroduced. And of course, they took much more than 14%. So they greatly widened the number of people getting into university. So it had that advantage for people, but they still had more or less a tripartite system, as largely exists in the former West, and it was by popular demand, and it was reintroduced. So you can put the clock back. So this is what fascinates me about it. You go to almost any East German town, you'll find one or two or more new gymnasium buildings. I visited one.
Can you talk about that?
Well, much. I mean, I don't speak anything remotely resembling fluent German. I spent a day with the English class, and it was in a town called Wismar, a seaport town on the Baltic, and you genuinely had the children of dockers and doctors in the same class. It seemed to me to be admirable, and the standard of education high enough for me to converse very readily with these 16 and 17-year-olds whose English was superb.
How did you compare them, or how did they appear different to you, to the grammar schools of your memory?
Well, the Germans never had, I don't think, the old English grammar schools quite a formal establishment, a lot of uniform, often quite strong religious influence. Right. Whereas the Germans, I think, have gone in for this very much in education, so it's different in that way. Mm-hmm. It's quite surprising you think of Germany as being a regimented country, but in fact not so. Mm-hmm. But I don't have that much experience in English grammar schools, so I couldn't really make it, especially as they are now, mm-hmm. which is a bizarre, anomalous position anyway, so I couldn't really tell you.
So there is this burgeoning field of research in behavioural genetics. If it turns out that schools do nothing, or they maybe add a few percentage points to people's life chances and their educational attainment, and it's all just one big self-fulfilling prophecy based on your IQ, your personality, your parents' social economic status, which is a reflection in turn of their IQ and their personality. If it turns out that schools do very little, we assume that you would still be in favour of grammar schools. Could you tell us why?
I'd be against comprehensive schools because however little grammar schools may add, I think comprehensive schools can subtract an enormous amount from the lives of several, quite large numbers, I think, of individuals whose life chances are ruined by them.
No.
I see. That makes sense.
No.
You've often alluded to, and in fact spoken about in your book, about the brain drain from America.
Well, I mentioned it. Yeah, I have a vague memory of it. I've been unable in vague lookings up to find much about it, except that it gets mentioned. Yeah. And I remember people talking about it a lot, but I don't claim any expertise in it.
Is it
people who took part in it, indeed. But the general view was, particularly in the sciences, that we were producing scientists at a much higher level than the American state school system was. And the Americans, noticing this, offered them large sums of money to go and live there. Well, who wouldn't? After they could speak English, it was easy. Mm-hmm. They could get them the visas. And who lost by this arrangement? Well, we lost by, because we trained and educated all these people who then went somewhere else.
Was this 60s, 70s?
This was talked about a lot, I remember, in the early 60s.
From this anecdotal vantage point, perhaps not as studied, How did this take place? Would it be?
I have no idea. If you want details, you'll have to ask somebody else. I hope somebody will write a history of it, but it isn't me.
But it would be mostly universities, companies, a mixture.
Well, I would imagine that they would. What the thing I heard all the time was that a set of English A-levels in the early 1960s was considered at least the equivalent of an American college degree, and that our education system was producing people who were considered very valuable by the Americans, and they went there. And you heard of people who had gone there. They'd been offered, by comparison with Britain, large sums of money to go. In those days, America was quite a difficult place for British people to go to. Most people couldn't travel much because of the currency restrictions on travel. It was a place where you didn't just go. So it was a remarkable thing if someone went to America. And it was happening. But as I say, I would love to see a history of it because I heard about it so much. And it's plainly, it's not going on now. But it was a constant feature of that period of my life. I remember it being talked about, and then I realised a few years ago that I hadn't heard it mentioned for a very, very long time.
Do you relate this to the decline of Britain as you?
Oh, completely. Well, I relate it directly to the fact that we trashed our school system, because half the problem with grammar schools is that if you destroyed them, then you destroy the gold standard of the whole education system. And you then, the examination system then has to be diluted and inflated to cope with a lower level of education. Of course, that means that bad state schools can survive and appear to be doing well because their children are getting high grade GCSEs and A-levels, even though they're not actually producing particularly good work. Universities have to cope with this by devaluing their degrees. And the other thing which happens is that the private sector, which only ever educates about 7%, is handed on a plate a huge gift simply by existing and by breathing in. A decently run private school can get almost all its pupils high grades in low grade examinations. So the private schools look terrific. They don't have to make any effort. So the old competition that they were having against really tough grammar schools back at the end of the end of the 50s and the early 60s is over. It's a breeze for them, and they can produce these prospectuses showing everybody that ever goes to school comes out garlanded with A stars and grade 9s, and parents will flock to them and pay their gigantic fees. So, but while all this is going on, the actual standard of education being provided by all the schools, state and private, is immensely lower than it was before. Only state grammar schools are based entirely on ability and on rigour could counteract that inflation, and bad money drives out good, and it has done.
So in what ways would these emigres to the United States staying in the UK have affected this decline, do you see?
Not at all, as far as I know. I can't think of any way in which they would have done. I mean, a country suffers in terms of education. I don't know, but in terms of a country suffers when it has fewer talented people in it. That's why the East Germans built the wall.
Do you imagine there would have been more resistance against the closing down of grammar schools?
I don't think so. No, I mean there was a lot of resistance, but it was just overridden.
Right.
There was no shortage of intelligent people arguing that we should keep the grammar school in the civil service, in politics, and elsewhere. But it was not. There was no. It wasn't a majority, and it wasn't going to swing any votes. So it didn't make any difference. So I shouldn't have affected in the slightest.
Before we get on to the role of the family and marriage, which is obviously a key socializing force in young people's lives and their educational attainment and their life outcomes generally. Have you been to Michaela School?
Yes.
Yeah. What did you think of that?
I have a sort of pact
with Catherine Burbles.
I just don't talk about it.
Fair enough.
Right.
Can I ask you a cheekier question, perhaps abstracting out from Michaela's lessons? Do you think that the type of militaristic discipline, right, where you can't speak in the corridors because then you can't have bullying and the kids seem to feel safer? If we cannot have grammar schools, is this a route that you would at least favour in order?
Well, it's a Burkean point, isn't it? If people don't know how to restrain themselves from within, then they get restrained from without. just that's the choice everybody has to make. And the kind of world we've chosen is one in which people don't restrain themselves very much, do they? So what do you expect?
Would you like to move on to
yes,
the family?
Indeed. We see that when you've mentioned either education, when you've been debating education or the family, you identify both as pillars, the pillars of society, of any society, and you see both the demise of the family and of education as central to the decline of the country.
Well, the married family is what I talk about. I mean, there are other kinds of family apart from the married family, but the married family is the one which concerns me.
So, what benefits should marriage regain in order for it to serve the function and have the value that you see in it?
Well, in law, the fundamental idea of what is a tort in civil law is if somebody's done wrong, if somebody's broken a contract which they've signed, then the courts are supposed to support the person who's observed the contract and punish in some way the person who's broken the contract. So if you smash your car up and you go to the garage and they fix it and then you drive the car away and refuse to pay, they'll take you to court and you will be made to pay because that's the job of the courts. But if you swear a solemn agreement to remain married for life to somebody and you break that agreement, then the courts will take your side against the party to the agreement who wants to keep it. That's the fundamental thing you have to understand in the nature of marriage law in almost all major Western countries since the middle 60s. The law actually takes the side of the person who wants to break the agreement. It's unique. I can't think of any other aspect of life in which the law actually takes the side of the contract breaker. And this revolution is fundamental to the way in which life is lived now. Anybody who wants to remain married does not have the support of the law or the state or culture. It's considered obstructive and a nuisance to society and to everybody else. And if you can't reverse that, then you can't have a system based upon lifelong marriage. And it's extraordinarily recent, this. And I always cite the fact when I was a reporter for an evening newspaper down in Swindon in the early 1970s, there were two things that the junior reporters had to do all the time. One of them was people who were getting married would send in a form describing where it was going to take place, and from these forms you would do a brief 2-paragraph story which would appear in the paper about their marriage. And one of the things which it said was the bride wore. And it was a standing joke in the office when it said the bride wore an Empire line dress. It meant she was pregnant. In those days, an awful lot of people got married because they were pregnant, because that was the thing to do. It's what they did, and there were a lot of Empire line dresses. And the other thing that junior reporters had to do was to go round when people's golden weddings came up. And there were a lot of people who had golden weddings. It's 50 years married. And we used to go around. And we would always ask them what the secret of happy marriage was, and they would always say the same thing. They would always say, give and take. Every time. It was the same interview over and over again. But the thing was, there were a lot of them. In 1973, there were a lot of people who'd been married for 50 years and didn't think it was unusual. You won't find either of those things going on now. You won't find people getting married because they're pregnant, and you won't find people staying married for 50 years because that's gone. But it was just at the end of it. I call it just the end of it because in 1968-69, the Labour government, bizarrely, in one of the few of its cultural revolutionary things, which was actually done with government backing rather than a private member's bill, it revolutionised marriage law.
What other kind of provisions, both legal and perhaps social or political, marriage should be given to incentivize people to get?
I would like the tax system to incentivize it. I would, for instance, I would like a system whereby it would be if all kinds of things could be incentivized, which used to be incentivized, considered good, which would make it easier for people to live on one income than on two when they were raising children, for instance. I'd like the tax and benefit system to be generous to people who had children. Something which ours, frankly, isn't very, comparing, say, with France. Just for example, I don't know about other countries, but it's not particularly generous. But it was also used to be this is gone now, but there used to be a thing called mortgage interest relief. And there was a long period when if two people were unmarried, they could get 2 lots of mortgage interest tax relief, which is worth quite a lot of money, on a house that they were buying, whereas if they got married, they only got one. There were things like that going on as well, but the tax system, more or less now, unless you're about 90, there's a very old marriage allowance which survives for those few people. But apart from that, I don't think the tax system really recognises marriage at all as a thing to be encouraged. But I wouldn't mind if it were neutral. It would be nice if it were not, from my point of view. But I'm not arguing that the tax system should necessarily push people towards being married. I just think the legal system should not push people away from being married and to make marriage pointless. I quote Brenda Hale, who's now the Supreme Court woman, wasn't at the time, saying that she couldn't work out what remaining legal benefits there were in being married, and this was 30 years ago. And there are very, very few. They've almost all, the privileges of marriages were almost all been given to somebody else, to other forms of relationship. And now we actually have heterosexual civil partnership.
Which Germaine Greer said in the Oxford Union debate you did with her wasn't a thing. I think that you did that in 2016, 2017.
Yeah.
So
yeah, well, it's not Germaine Greer's main concern, but I'd always thought those who said once you have homosexual civil partnership, you'll have to have heterosexual civil partnership. I thought it was bound to come. It couldn't not. And what you then basically have, the French have this thing called the pacte, I think, which is more or less the same. It's not a marriage, and it's extremely easy to dissolve, even easier than marriage, which is fantastically easy to dissolve. But it's the easy dissolution. It's the encouragement of the idea that the moment a marriage goes awry, that the only thing to do is to dissolve it. And also the fascinating thing, as far as I know, I've put this forward and no one has ever challenged me on it. I don't believe there's any point at which the English marriage law makes it harder to get a divorce if you have young children than if you haven't. There's no consideration given to that aspect of it at all, and you would have thought that would be fundamental if you were so. And everybody says, well, divorce, it makes people so much happier. In the 60s, you know what the most popular song in the charts ever was? It was in the charts for longer than any other. It was at number 1 for months and months and months and months. It wasn't the Beatles. It was a horrible song called Please Release Me, sung by a man called Engelbert Humperdinck. And the reason why it was an anthem to divorce. It's the repeated line, please release me, let me go. It was all about divorce. Because a lot of people felt great release from unhappy marriages. I don't deny it, but the fact is that there were other people in a lot of these marriages who suffered, and they were the children, and they continue to do so. And it's huge. And what marriage does is basically says you the adults, are more important than the children. The divorce law in its current state, it says adults are more important than children. And that's what we've decided as a society, and the consequences for the children, particularly the ones who are in many cases deprived of fathers, are huge. And once marriage ceases to be general, a lot of people don't get married in the first place. So people say, well, the divorce figures seem to have dropped this year. And you say, well, yes, they have, because there weren't enough married people to get divorced. That's why the divorce figures have dropped. It's not because there are fewer people not living with married partners. It's because fewer people got married in the first place. And again, those families, such as they are more easily dissolved. And again, it leads over and over again to fatherless children, which I think every piece of research shows. Of course, there must be individual cases where children grow up without their fathers and everybody works out fine. But in general terms, it's considerably worse than where there is a father.
Yeah, I was just listening to Jordan Peterson talk to Warren Farrell, who, I don't know if you know, one of the fathers of the men's movement, actually was originally, I think, a second wave feminist, and he's just written a book, written in 2018, called The Boy Crisis, which I'm reading now, and it is shocking. I mean, 1 in 3, I think, now in North America and the UK, 1 in 3 children grow up without a father. The absence of a father affects boys much.
Oh, yes. I think there is respectable research on this matter which shows it. I can't cite it, but who really doubts it anyway?
Yeah.
But I think it was preventable. I think that the law chose to indulge the adults over the children. And also the law didn't ever really care all that much about marriage. And when the church stopped caring about marriage, which it did, then there you are. Goodbye. But that was a huge revolution. But I still find it completely fascinating that you have this complete reversal of the normal law of tort in marriage law. That it's the breaker of the contract who gets us the courts on his or her side.
So presumably you would be in favour of it being harder to leave a marriage.
Well, I think I put it shouldn't be so easy, but I also think it should be harder to get married in the first place.
Right. Okay. So, do you think if it were harder to get married and harder to leave a marriage, more people would get married?
Probably not, because again, it's not. You can't. It's ridiculous to imagine that particularly after the invention of the contraceptive pill, that you could return to the marital arrangements which we had before that. And you know, the contraceptive pill was a politically.
It is in your book.
Yeah, which. It was a politically backed research. The people who backed it wanted to revolutionise society, and they did so.
So on this point, you've decried therefore the role that the state has played in the dissolution of marriage and married families. What are your thoughts on merely ceremonial marriages absent a religious context? So I am aware that you've made a point about religious marriage is still upholding the notion of marriage that you believe it is intrinsic to the concept. But how about marriages that do not want to involve the state but are not part of a religious tradition?
I don't know. I don't. It's not. I haven't thought about it. I don't know. I think that once you've destroyed a culture in which lifelong marriage is considered normal, then you're tossing about in an ocean of uncertainty. Nobody really knows where it will lead, and the people most likely to be washed overboard are the children.
Okay, final main question before 2 quick-fire ones. You often describe yourself as a pessimist. Is there anything, any trend that you recognise as a source of narrow or specific optimism?
Bicycle brakes have got better.
Firmer?
Less accidents for cyclists.
Yeah, I said bicycle brakes have got better. No, I do not. Bicyclists themselves have got worse, so there are more accidents. But it is an undeniable fact that bicycle brakes are better than they were when I first started riding.
I assume you detest the new optimists, as they're called, the Steven Pinkers and the Hans Roslings, who say it's better than it's ever been and we're on a linear trajectory.
Well, that's materialist, surely. I mean, there are a lot of things which are materially better, but what price have you paid for that material progress? And for how many people are they materially better? You only have to go to Africa to find out how thinly spread that particular benefit is, and how. Now, what are you? And you only need to go to Canton in China to see the level of life of people in a modern industrialized society. How long are we going to be spared that? We're living on the capital of centuries, but it will run out, and then what will this be like? You look out of the window here, and what will you see? You won't see many trees. It'll just be concrete. Concrete, plastic, traffic fumes. It'll all. My vision of the future is the whole world being like the suburbs of Istanbul, just going on and on and on forever and ever and ever with people going and their car horns.
It sounds like a more modern twist to Orwell's Animal Farm.
No, it's different. It's not about oppression. It's about desolation.
Brave New World, then. Brave New World, then.
Well, no, Brave New World is actually quite nice in many ways. The worst that could happen to you is you'd be sent to the Falkland Islands, which are rather pleasant.
And rather
I can speak from experience.
Right.
I got a suntan in the Falkland Islands. So clean.
Well, not if they're sending a lot of people there.
Well, they didn't. Not many people wanted to go, but if that was the way, that was the way your mind went, then that's where they would send you. But in terms of, for most people, when I have arguments with people about legalization of drugs or marriage or any of these things, they seem to want a society pretty much like Brave New World. In fact, Brave New World is much nicer than the society they will get. At least it works.
Well, at least we're not that advanced, yeah.
No, nothing like. No, one of the key fallacy in Brave New World is they get 100,000 biochemists to produce a pill which makes you happy and doesn't do you any harm. No one's ever done that. Because pills that make you happy are bound to do you harm, and that's one of the really big problems. Soma is an impossible dream.
That moves us nicely on to our first quickfire question. What are your 3 favourite books?
3 favourite?
It can be fiction or non-fiction.
No, I don't. I could. If I said 3, then it would mean I'd forgotten something else. Great Expectations. All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. And just springing to mind, East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Will do for 3.
And last quickfire question: do you have any advice for young people other than emigrate?
No, that's my advice. Leave.
What if you're already out of this country for the international
Then I have
audience?
no advice to offer. I mean, you've got your own problems. I can only offer you expert advice on the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland.
But if Peter Hitchens were 24 today, what would you like him to know that he might not because of what today is?
He wouldn't listen.
He wouldn't listen. Okay.
Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. It was my first in-person interview, and with your support there will be many more to come. The only reason that this is possible is due to your support. So if you'd like to support alternative media, get your name in the credits and early access to videos and even Zoom calls with myself, then you can become a patron for as little as £1 or $1. The link is in the description. You will also help pay for my parking ticket in Oxford that I received whilst interviewing Peter, so thank you, Oxford, for that. Remember, you can listen to this podcast on all the major podcasting platforms. Thank you for watching, and as always, I will see you next Sunday.